The night began like any other, dinner plans and quiet routines, until a pulse of metal and glass turned ordinary into horror. At 11:47 p.m., an SUV screamed across the I-85 exit ramp and slammed into the guardrail with a force that ripped the vehicle apart. Witnesses described the car spinning twice before flipping onto its side, smoke clawing from the crushed hood while shards of glass scattered like fallen stars. Flashing red and blue strobed the asphalt as first responders descended, their boots slapping pavement against the soundtrack of wailing sirens. By the time firefighters pried the mangled driver's door open, a crowd had gathered, voices frayed with fear and urgency. They found Yandy unconscious and barely breathing, a faint pulse under bruised skin, tangled in a twisted frame that seemed to mock the life inside. Paramedics worked with clinical speed, stabilizing her neck, fitting oxygen, and preparing a frantic extraction. A medic shouted that she was fading. CPR was performed in the street, hands slamming against a chest with desperate rhythm, while a stretcher was readied beneath roaring traffic and stunned onlookers. In those moments, the ordinary world receded. Facts condensed into single, urgent commands. Clear airway, start compressions, load up. Neighbors dialed 911, phones trembled in trembling hands, and social feeds began to ignite with a single, terrible question: is she alive? Within minutes, the ambulance roared toward Grady Memorial, lights flaring, time collapsing into a breathless race. The wreckage was left as a sad monument on the ramp, twisted metal, a smear of tire marks, and the echo of what had been. City cameras that later proved unreliable flickered and went dark for a crucial window of minutes, leaving gaps where answers should have been. At the hospital doors, paramedics transferred Yandy into a corridor pulsing with fluorescent light, and a medic's voice carried one statement that froze everyone in place. She's alive, but it's bad. The words landed like a verdict, an unbearable mixture of hope and dread. This was not just another celebrity incident. It was a sudden rupture in a life built on strength. A raw, public moment that would expose fragile truths and raise questions nobody had planned to ask. Families gathered nearby, friends praying, and cameras began circling. An instant chorus of grief and speculation that would not quiet as the night stretched on. Hope and panic collided. Paramedics moved like a practiced unit, every motion precise despite the chaos. They slotted a cervical collar around Yandy's neck, checked pupils and airway, and worked to stem bleeding as traffic fumes and the smell of burning rubber filled the ramp. A medic barked orders. Another fed oxygen through a mask as machines were prepared for transport. Her heart rate dipped dangerously low and responders began compressions again, their faces hard with concentration until monitors showed a faint return. Bystanders watched with horror, phones recording, while volunteers tended to those nearby. The decision to rush to Grady Memorial was immediate. Every minute counted, and the ambulance team secured her to the stretcher with practiced speed. Loading her into the ambulance was a choreography of survival. Straps tightened, IV lines checked, notes passed between EMTs like spoken prayers. The sirens that followed were not just sound. They were a demand, a relentless plea as lights swept windows and halted traffic. Inside the ambulance, paramedics adjusted meds, spoke into radios with clipped calm, and ran through interventions to keep Yandy breathing. A medic murmured they were losing time. Hospital staff would have mere minutes to stabilize her further. The drive to emergency felt suspended, a narrow tunnel of urgency bordered by the slow-motion world outside. Outside Grady Memorial, the trauma bay stood ready, doors flung open as the ambulance thundered in. Paramedics transferred her through a gauntlet of hands and relayed the scene. Blunt force trauma, possible internal bleeding, unstable vitals, ongoing resuscitation. Doctors and nurses moved with desperate rhythm. Airway secured, scans ordered, blood products prepared. A surgeon's quick assessment set the next steps: emergency imaging and possible operative intervention, and family members were ushered into a waiting area, where promises of updates felt thin. The medic who had driven whispered, "We did everything we could," but everyone knew the fight had only just begun. News crews began circling. Hospital staff braced, and Mendez was en route. His phone frantic with calls as hope and dread tangled into a single unbearable knot of waiting and prayer. The hospital's trauma unit felt like another universe. Walls buzzing with fluorescent light, machines humming with mechanical urgency, and the sharp smell of antiseptic clawing at the air. When Mendez arrived, breathless from the run through double doors, the sight of doctors swarming over Yandy shattered him. He stumbled against a wall, clutching his head, his voice cracking as he begged to be let in. Security tried holding him back, but the sheer collapse of a husband unraveling broke protocol. A nurse guided him forward, whispering, "Just stand back, but you can see her." Inside, the scene was chaos made methodical. A trauma surgeon barked commands. "Clamp! More suction! We're losing her pressure!" Blood pooled across sterile sheets as nurses raced to swap IV bags and respiratory techs forced oxygen into damaged lungs. The steady beep of monitors suddenly flatlined into a piercing alarm. Mendez dropped to his knees, fists on the cold floor, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. Doctors launched chest compressions, counting aloud in rhythm, while another called for rapid transfusion. Mendez pressed his forehead to the base of the bed, his body shaking as his tears hit the tiles below. A crash cart slammed through the doors, paddles charged, and the command came sharp. "Clear!" Yandy's body jolted under electricity, her chest rising in defiance against death itself. The monitor flickered, stuttered, then pulsed again, a fragile heartbeat, too faint, but present. Mendez cried out, half thankfulness, half desperation, gripping her hand though it was cold and taped with IV lines. The room became a war zone against time. Every second felt stolen, every procedure a gamble between life and nothingness. Doctors fought to control internal bleeding. Surgical tools glinted under sterile light, while machines hissed and beeped in relentless rhythm. Mendez hovered helpless, his whispers a constant stream. "Don't leave us. Please don't leave." Nurses glanced his way, eyes heavy with both sympathy and resignation. They had seen husbands like him before, but rarely with stakes this public, this raw. When the lead surgeon finally stepped back, sweat glistening under his cap, he spoke words Mendez clung to like scripture. "She's critical, but stable enough to move upstairs. The fight isn't over." Mendez collapsed into a chair, hands covering his face, sobs echoing through the sterile corridor. In that moment, the man known for his resilience became a shattered father and husband, facing a reality no camera or show could script. While surgeons worked, the waiting room swelled with a mix of silence and sobs. Children clutched blankets, their wide eyes searching for comfort in a world suddenly hostile. Relatives paced the corridor, phones buzzing with incoming calls they could barely answer. The smell of coffee mixed with hospital disinfectant, creating an atmosphere of exhaustion and dread. Castmates from Love and Hip Hop began arriving one by one, faces pale under camera lights already stationed outside the hospital. Some rushed forward, embracing Mendez when he emerged briefly, while others sat quietly, murmuring prayers into clasped hands. A gospel hymn hummed under someone's breath, soon joined by whispers until the waiting room carried a fragile chorus of faith. Kids huddled close to a grandmother, who whispered reassurances she barely believed. A cousin scrolled endlessly through updates online, watching hashtags climb into trending spots, while another relative snapped at her, "Turn that off. This isn't a show." The tension between private grief and public spotlight gnawed at everyone. Friends pulled chairs into circles, forming makeshift support groups, swapping stories of Yandy's laughter, her activism, her determination. Every word felt like both a comfort and a reminder of how much could be lost. A few sobbed openly, tears dripping onto hospital tile, while others stared blankly at walls, unable to process the weight of waiting. In one corner, Mendez's voice cracked as he spoke to his children, telling them their mother was fighting hard, that doctors were doing everything they could. He avoided words like if or maybe, choosing only when she wakes up. His resolve became an anchor, even as his face betrayed the storm inside. The waiting room became its own battlefield, not of scalpels and machines, but of emotions, faith, and the unbearable ache of time stretching too long. News of the crash traveled faster than the sirens that carried Yandy to the hospital. Within minutes, hashtags flooded timelines. Pray for Yandy, Stay Strong Yandy, and Oath, Love, and Hip Hop Family began trending across Twitter and Instagram. Videos from shaken bystanders, shaky and blurred, circulated like wildfire. Some clips showed flashing ambulance lights, others caught fragments of Mendeecees pacing outside the emergency doors. Fans reposted them with captions of disbelief. Not Yandy, please not her. Celebrity voices amplified the storm. Cardi B tweeted a broken heart emoji with the words, "Prayers up for sis." LL Cool J wrote, "Sending strength to Yandy's family tonight." Former castmates dropped emotional posts, some attaching throwback photos from sets and reunions. The entertainment world, often divided, seemed united in grief and prayer. As hours stretched, the digital noise spilled into real streets. In Harlem, Atlanta, and Brooklyn, fans lit candles at street corners. Outside Grady Memorial, a growing crowd held vigil, singing softly, holding posters and homemade signs that read, "We love you, Yandy." Murals began appearing, quick spray-painted tributes on concrete walls, colorful portraits capturing her resilience. Strangers who had never met her held hands, whispering prayers as the night deepened. Online theories, however, grew just as rapidly. Some claimed the crash wasn't an accident, hinting at shadowy motives. Others urged patience, warning against conspiracy. But once planted, doubt spreads quickly, and social media became a battlefield of grief, love, and suspicion. What began as a tragedy became a movement, a communal chorus demanding hope, demanding answers, demanding Yandy's survival. As vigils burned and hashtags trended, whispers of mystery began weaving into the story. Eyewitness accounts surfaced from drivers who claimed they saw more than just an SUV losing control. One woman told a local news crew she had spotted a dark sedan trailing Yandy's vehicle minutes before the crash. Another driver insisted he watched that same car speed away from the scene once chaos erupted. Police at first downplayed these accounts, noting the confusion of nighttime traffic. But witnesses repeated their versions with startling consistency. A rideshare driver swore the sedan had no headlights on until just before the impact. A nearby shop owner claimed his outdoor security cam caught a shadowy vehicle but admitted the recording suddenly glitched and froze right as the SUV spun out. Then came the revelation of malfunctioning traffic cameras. Several units on that stretch of I-85, cameras meant to record everything, reportedly lost feed for a 5-minute window surrounding the collision. For many, coincidence felt too convenient. Online forums erupted with speculation. Was someone trying to erase evidence? By morning, the accident was no longer being discussed as just tragedy. It was evolving into a possible crime. News outlets replayed grainy footage, analysts dissected it frame by frame, and amateur investigators posted slowed-down clips pointing out shadows that could be another car. Families in the waiting room tried to block out the noise, but even they couldn't ignore the shift in tone. Mendeecees himself, still raw from hours at Yandy's side, told a reporter through clenched teeth, "If somebody did this, they're going to answer for it." The narrative had changed. Yandy wasn't simply the victim of bad luck on a highway ramp. To many, she had become the target of something darker, and questions were mounting that no official statement could silence. The grainy clip arrived like a spark thrown into dry tinder. In the days after the crash, a security camera recording, shaky, low resolution, and looped with static, surfaced online, showing Yandy's SUV on the I-85 exit ramp. For a few tense seconds, the footage captured a dark sedan close behind, maintaining a steady pace as if shadowing the SUV's every move. Then the frame blurred, the SUV veered, and the sedan accelerated away into the night. The video was hardly cinematic. It was a fuzzy, baked-in moment of evidence that suddenly felt far heavier than its pixels. Within hours, the clip spread across platforms. Fans slowed it frame by frame, pausing on potential proof of a second car. Influencers layered commentary over the grain, podcasters replayed it with heated speculation, and amateur sleuths on forums began mapping likely routes and timestamps. Still frames were dissected for make and model. Tires, taillights, and bumper shapes were debated with obsessive focus. Social feeds became a chorus of theories, some persuasive, some conspiratorial, all demanding answers. Public scrutiny intensified. Protesters and supporters pressed for transparency, release all footage, publish camera timelines, explain why surveillance failed at a critical window. Reporters crowded police briefings, microphones thrust forward as flashing lights painted anxious faces. The department faced an escalating wave of questions from citizens and online detectives alike. Tech experts urged caution, warning low-res clips can mislead and motion artifacts can fabricate phantom vehicles. Yet for a public already wound tight, the footage functioned as a rallying point. It shifted the narrative from tragic accident to possible crime, and that change had consequences. More leaks, more subpoenas, more eyes on every step of the investigation. Every repost added weight to the call for answers. Every new analysis bred fresh demands for speed and clarity. The clip was small. The impact was huge. The public demanded answers and would not relent ever. Threats that once whispered in private bled quickly into public view. Shortly after the crash, messages allegedly sent to Yandy surfaced, anonymous notes, cryptic voicemails, and cold emails warning her to stop digging into powerful people. Friends said the messages were linked to business disputes and clashes with figures she had publicly criticized through her activism. For someone who had become a public advocate, the threats were chilling. Speculation about motive spread fast. Some commentators argued the crash could be retaliation for Yandy's outspoken stance on corruption and reform. Others suggested greedy rivals or soured partnerships could have played a part. Talk shows and social feeds turned motive into headline fodder, layering pressure on investigators to find answers and explain why someone would want Yandy silenced. Mendeecees, raw and furious, channeled grief into action. He hired private security, met with detectives, and vowed publicly to protect his family and pursue whoever was responsible. Investigators said they would follow every lead, but the mix of leaks, rumors, and anonymous tips complicated the probe. Legal teams scrutinized contracts. Insurance investigators rechecked policies, and civil rights advocates urged caution and transparency. The possibility that Yandy's activism had made her a target blurred lines between celebrity drama and serious political retaliation, attracting greater scrutiny and stirring debate about safety for outspoken figures. For Mendeecees, the motive mattered less than protection. He concentrated on securing his family, demanding a thorough investigation, and making sure his children were shielded from the media onslaught. Friends described him as relentless, a man reshaped by fear and devotion, tender in private, merciless toward those he believed threatened his wife. Ultimately, threats reframed the story. What began as a near-fatal accident now read, for many, like an attempt to silence a powerful voice. That shift hardened public resolve. They wanted not only recovery, but accountability. And they demanded justice without compromise. The family moved quickly from shock to action, hiring a private security detail and retaining legal counsel to navigate the crisis. Within hours, plainclothes guards and uniformed officers were posted at hospital entrances, screening visitors and escorting family members through back corridors. The security team established strict protocols: no unauthorized phones near the ICU, visitor lists verified, and a single point of contact for media inquiries. A family spokesperson released a concise statement. "Our priority is Yandy and the children. Please respect their privacy as we cooperate with investigators." Lawyers filed emergency motions to seal medical records and sensitive communications, citing both privacy and safety concerns. Protective orders were sought to prevent the disclosure of details that might jeopardize the ongoing probe. For the children, measures were immediate and practical. School pickups altered, trusted relatives assigned as guardians, and a counselor brought in to explain events in age-appropriate terms. Friends and colleagues offered rotating support, but access was carefully controlled. Insurance representatives and the family's business managers convened quietly, assessing liabilities and securing assets, while legal counsel shared private leads with investigators. The visible presence of security calmed some nerves. Paparazzi and onlookers clustered at a respectful distance, while online trolls continued to churn rumors. Media requests were funneled through counsel. Still, for Mendeecees and the family, the new reality was clear. Protection, legal strategy, and the children's welfare were now the priorities. Moves were measured, public lines rehearsed, and efforts aimed at safeguarding a fragile household under siege. The medical battle stretched into long, quiet days and sleepless nights, counted in scans and the steady cadence of monitors. Teams worked in shifts beneath humming lights, delivering updates with practiced caution. Stable but critical, doctors repeated, then outlined small improvements. Imaging revealed swelling and damage. Some areas showed slow recovery, others remained concerning. Therapists kept limbs moving with passive exercises. Speech specialists checked reflexes and responses with gentle prompts. Mendeecees never left. He sat by the bedside, whispering stories, playing voice messages, and resting his forehead against her hand. Time carved lines of weariness into his face. Exhaustion and fear pooled under his eyes. Doctors reported tiny neurological flickers, brief finger twitches, fleeting eye tracking, slight increases in brain activity, each one amplified into hope. But setbacks arrived without warning. Fevers, spikes in swelling, or shifts in vitals that triggered urgent scans. Nurses monitored for infections and secondary complications, treating every change as a possible turning point. For Mendeecees, the vigil was both solace and torment. He thanked staff for small victories and then walked corridors replaying the night in his head, haunted by could-have-beens. Family rotated in to read messages and sing, while counselors met children to explain in measured words. Updates that once would have felt minor became lifelines to a waiting public, shared across feeds and at candlelit gatherings. Doctors cautioned the road ahead was uncertain. Progress might stall, reverse, or come in tiny increments over months. Still, the slivers of response mattered. A squeeze of a hand, eyes that tracked movement, a breath that stabilized under less support. Those fragile signs sustained a weary circle of family, friends, medical staff, and fans, binding them to a slender but stubborn thread of hope together. For 31 days, the ICU held a fragile hush, measured in monitors and whispered prayers. Then, in a stretch of morning light, a tiny movement fractured the stillness. An eyelid flutter, so slight it might have been missed. Nurses stopped. Machines stilled around the sound of a single intake of breath. Mendeecees, dozing in a chair at the bedside, straightened as if pulled by a cord. He leaned in close, voice thin with hope, and began to speak. Names, memories, the small jokes that had shaped their life. Her fingers twitched. Slowly, as if testing the air, her eyes shifted focus and tracked his face. The room exhaled as monitors registered activity that had not been there. A nurse called for the attending physician, whose face registered disbelief and cautious elation. Mendeecees pressed his forehead to her hand, tears cutting clean lines down his cheeks. Word moved faster than any protocol. A glow spread across the hospital as staff shared the news in hurried, hushed tones. By midday, the world outside had already begun to change. Reporters gathered. Social feeds surged with footage and prayers of thanks. Fans who had spent weeks holding vigil erupted into relief, lighting candles and chanting online. Medical teams warned progress would be fragile and slow, that rehabilitation lay ahead. But for a breath-stilled world, the sight of her eyes opening was proof enough. She had returned. Hope, fierce, had reclaimed the room now. Days after the crash, investigators announced an arrest that transformed speculation into formal action. A 38-year-old man was taken into custody. Police said his vehicle matched the one seen in viral surveillance, and that he had ties to a shell company linked to a rival media outfit. Detectives cited phone records connecting him to an anonymous number that had sent threats to Yandy before the collision. Search warrants targeted storage units and email accounts. Subpoenas sought bank transfers and communications that could reveal coordination. Prosecutors charged the suspect with attempted murder and conspiracy. He declined to speak, invoking counsel, while investigators continued to map financial and location data that suggested planning rather than random chaos. The arrest rippled through the industry. Reporters asked whether higher-level figures ordered the attack. Insiders muttered about payments and bad blood. Civil investigations and insurance reviews began in parallel as legal teams prepared for prolonged scrutiny. For Mendeecees and the family, the news brought mixed feelings: relief that someone was held, and fear that the case would expose painful details. Authorities were careful to stress that charges needed proof and that an arrest did not equal guilt. Investigators indicated more arrests were possible as subpoenas targeted corporate emails and ledgers. Prosecutors hinted at a broader conspiracy. Social feeds erupted, with fans demanding swift justice and transparency and accountability. The road to recovery began the moment she opened her eyes, but the journey ahead was long and methodical. Medical teams assembled a coordinated rehabilitation plan. Neurologists, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, and speech-language pathologists working in sequence. Early treatment focused on fundamentals: passive range of motion exercises to prevent stiffness, assisted transfers to protect joints, breathing drills to rebuild respiratory strength, and meticulous wound care to support healing. Physical therapy progressed toward active tasks: supported standing, gait training with parallel bars, balance drills, and incremental resistance work to rebuild muscle and coordination. Speech therapy addressed swallowing safety, vocalization, and language retrieval through repetition, music therapy, and cueing exercises. Neuro-rehabilitation sessions targeted attention, memory, and problem-solving with graded cognitive tasks and computerized training. Pain control, nutrition planning, and sleep hygiene were integrated to optimize recovery and prevent setbacks. Progress arrived in fragments. Some mornings yielded measurable gains, a steadier step, a clearer phrase, but other days required rest after fatigue or swelling. Her memory retained the core of her life. Names and stories remained, though small details sometimes needed gentle prompting. Scars marked her body and reminded everyone of the night she survived. For many, they became symbols of resilience. Family presence was central. Mendeecees attended therapy, learned home techniques, and supported consistent practice. Children were guided by counselors to engage in age-appropriate visits. Clinicians framed expectations honestly: months of staged milestones, outpatient therapy, and possible long-term support. Yet optimism persisted. Consistent therapy, attentive medical care, and relentless resolve could yield meaningful improvement. The slow, steady work of rebuilding had begun, measured by tiny victories and everyday persistence. Support groups and community programs rallied around her, offering resources, adaptive equipment, and round-the-clock encouragement that bolstered therapy and lifted spirits daily. And neighbors organized regular meal trains. Yandy's awakening shifted the narrative from grief to purpose. In a faint but steady voice, she pledged to use her recovery as fuel for justice and continued activism. Mendeecees vowed to pursue every lead, cooperating with prosecutors and private investigators while shielding their children from the media glare. A family spokesperson announced plans to establish a foundation supporting survivors of violence, a public commitment to turning pain into purpose. Legal teams pressed for transparency, while advocacy groups called for broader protections for public figures who speak out. The story transformed, from a personal tragedy to a symbol of resilience and accountability. Communities that once gathered in vigil now organized fundraisers, policy roundtables, and awareness campaigns. Producers and networks faced scrutiny. Conversations started about industry safety, ethics, and the costs of speaking truth. Mendeecees promised he would not rest until those responsible were held accountable, and Yandy expressed a quiet determination to rebuild. As this new chapter began, the public was invited to become part of the journey. Share your thoughts. Do you believe this was an accident or a targeted attack? Comment below, share this story, and subscribe for real-time updates. Your voice can help push for answers and keep the pressure on. Together we are stronger. Supporters created hashtags, donated to medical funds, printed shirts with the rallying cry, and organized marches demanding clarity and reform in industry practices and public safety measures for outspoken leaders everywhere. Stand with Yandy and demand accountability now. Keep watching, keep fighting together.